everyone. My name is Saeed. I'm the founder and CEO of Nextstars and your host and moderator today. We have a very, very interesting topic to discuss, very exciting webinar. We're going to really take a look at data versus policy in our immigration system. I'm honored to be joined today by Nino and Blayne from Immitracker. Nino is the co-founder of Immitracker, a platform that crowdsources immigration case data, and Blayne, also a co-founder to Immitracker and a licensed immigration professional. So thank you so much for joining me. If you can give us a little bit of background about yourself, and we'll delve into the topic and the questions.
Sure, I'll get started. Like you mentioned, my name is Nino. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Immitracker. We call it the Ways of Immigration. Essentially, as a platform, we anonymously crowdsource case data for immigration to Canada and Australia. And with the help of our trackers and analytical tools and our very popular WhatsApp community, we help immigrants figure out how long their immigration visa or citizenship process is going to take and what are some of the steps and pitfalls they can expect along the way. So if you look at it like this, Blayne and I are the two sides of the same coin, where he really looks at people as an immigration consultant. He really sees the process of them like figuring out which program works for them and how they apply. And then I'm the second side of that coin, where once they apply, I look more at the data and seeing like where is it taking them, how long is it going to take them, and what can they expect from the application process.
That's amazing. I really like that analogy, base for immigration. Exactly.
Exactly
It's
that. We love
exactly what you guys do. So yeah, Blayne, please.
Yeah, sure. So as I had mentioned, I'm the co-founder of Immitracker along with Nino. I'm also an immigration consultant. I've been operating Bright Immigration for quite some time. It's been over 15 years in Bright Immigration, Bright Recruitment. So I've been in that space for quite some time. Everything from recruitment, helping students, the whole gambit. So quite experienced in that arena. And I'm also a founder of a platform called Improved, which helps immigrants understand their immigration options and just creating a more ethical, transparent immigration environment for people. So yeah, I'm excited to be here and talk to you and your listeners and viewers for some immigration knowledge and hopefully some interesting insights.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm super excited about today's topic, because you have access to some on-the-ground information on how the applicants are feeling our immigration system and how they're experiencing, how they're engaging with our immigration system. So just to give some context and background, obviously, like Canada is a destination. We like to be the destination for the bright and talented and successful from all over the world. In 2022, we welcomed a whopping almost 450,000 new permanent residents. Everything was going up and up and up until recently that we have had a major policy shift. So now there's cuts everywhere in every program. And I first and foremost want to kind of get started with some like sentiment. What are you seeing, Blayne, from a policy perspective, and also like Nino and Blayne from the data perspective? What are you seeing amongst the sentiment of people? What really caused these policy shifts, and how people are feeling about it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so from the policy side, quite frankly, the changes were abrupt, but not surprising considering it's a political period. So quite frankly, I think a lot of these changes fundamentally were derived for political purposes, not necessarily for the perspective of immigration. I do think that the Liberal government, which is the government currently in power, and the government that brought us to huge numbers and are also bringing it down, they recognize that immigration is a very important lever for Canada and for us to solve some major problems in our nation, demographic issues being the primary reason and economic reasons, of course. So fundamentally, I think it's very political, which is why the changes were done last year at the end, and it's moving towards this year. So that way they could get ahead of the curve of being a little tougher on immigration. So that's one factor that at least my opinion, that's where it's coming from. What's tough is the sentiment is globally, it's definitely being tarnished. Immigration, people are looking to other countries, they're looking to other places now. And it's not necessarily because the numbers were decreased, it's because of how abrupt everything was and how, it was just another, I think, a reminder to many people recognizing that immigration is very, very inconsistent and it's risky and having a brand where it's very positive, very pro-immigration. Hey, come, essentially people thought it was very easy to come to Canada, to the complete reverse of that. I think that was probably the most devastating aspect of that, and I believe it's definitely damaged our brand. Just from speaking to people, seeing the interest levels being adjusted, and speaking to folks in other countries, and just the overall demand. So I think it is definitely impacted, and I think people need to also recognize that Canada is definitely a country many people want to immigrate to and visit, and they want to come here. But there's a lot of people that don't. And when you look at the immigration numbers, it's not like we're getting immigration from all around the world in even numbers. They're concentrated environments. So once you have a shift of opinions in those regions, immigration numbers are tough to kind of get back, right? So yeah, so that's kind of my whole perspective on that.
And I would like to add to that that we have definitely seen conversations about this happening in the community. And I think what Blayne touched upon was very important is that maybe over the past few years, especially with the numbers you mentioned, Saeed, there was maybe almost a perception that it would be quite easy, it's consistently easy to come to Canada, or there would always be these pathways available. But I think what people are not realizing that immigration is generally a very volatile and ever-changing process that can have abrupt changes like the ones mentioned last year. And I think what I've been noticing in the conversation of the community, people are more cognizant of that now, because I've seen a lot of links shared about like the upcoming election, worries about the election, worries about processing times being impacted, and maybe programs like going away. But a more important thing that I did want to mention, like while I noticed this on the Canadian side, for example, Australian immigration numbers are not even half of the numbers that we have for Canada, and they take 2, 3 times longer than what the people go through when they're getting their applications processed for Canada. So it's always a matter of perspective, right?
Oh, okay. So that's actually a very, very interesting insight. And you can comment on this because your platform has data from prospect immigrants to Australia and Canada, which, frankly speaking, these two countries are if someone's looking for a new home, for a new destination, these two countries often compete with each other, as a destination. One obviously is much colder than the other, but typically people think about these two countries as alternative options. So it's kind of interesting to hear that they're not doing any better. If anything, they're experiencing worse delays. Is that what you? Okay.
It's not even delays. The Australian immigration process is deliberately slower. They don't
Uh,
aim to have like if you look at their processing time estimates on the government of the Australia, some of the most popular programs are well over 1 year. And I've seen
mhm.
people commenting taking even longer. And so that's why I mentioned that it was important to keep this in perspective because like while Canada is changing all of these things, if you look at the data, for example, processing times for the Canadian Experience Class program are only 5 months right now, which is
Mhm.
way faster than pretty much any Australian program I've at least noticed on our platform.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think to Nino's point is just we also have to compare what are we, other countries, other regions. Canada is still, even now, is still definitely has better programs. They have faster processing
Mhm.
than many countries. So that's an important notice as well, right? So, I guess Canada does have room, I guess, in a geopolitical environment when you're doing comparisons. They have some room to take longer. They have some room to be a bit stricter. They have room to do that. But it does adjust the brand though, the brand and what Canada is known for, or what the world perceives Canada to be, that
Yeah.
brand's impacted. So now, like you said, Australia might be more attractive, and I know Germany's has programs, and Japan's got issues. They're gonna have the demographic issues. They're gonna have to start recognizing and using immigration. So yeah, all of that above.
I think, this is very, very good points that you mentioned, and I really enjoy the perspective. At Nextstars also, while Canada is our primary market in terms of connecting entrepreneurs with resources and capital, we often have clients that look at, and we always work with the client where it's the best interest of the client to relocate their business to. And we've done very successful cases to Finland, to Netherlands, from all over the world. And what I can tell you is that you kind of want to be in immigration also in the sales business. You want to sell to the can to prospect to come to your country. So you want to ultimately bring people in that have options and alternatives, that they're not coming necessarily to Canada out of desperation. Though on a humanitarian level, we can all agree that there's room, we need to keep the doors open, obviously. But also you want to be in the competition for that top talent. And what I think has damaged brand Canada, though still is very much intact, is the 180s in policies. Like you go this direction one day and then like people are planning, blah, 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 there's a sentiment, and then it goes 180. And these things, as Blayne, you mentioned, in communities, the agents, resellers of brand Canada, once they kind of decide to advertise a different option, it's often very challenging to bring the morals back to the initial level, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. There's a whole ecosystem behind it, and people in Canada, being in Canada, you don't recognize that there's this whole ecosystem that exists. And like you mentioned, the agents out there, many of them aren't exclusive to Canada. They don't, sometimes they're not necessarily licensed, so they just represent different countries that one could go to. And whatever the brand is, and also whatever the community is saying. If the community is saying, oh, Germany's a place to go, well, then now they got to start looking at Germany, for example. So you are right. And it is just like any other business in a sales process. Once you lose a client, it's hard to get them back. And retention is a factor. So, if you look at this from a business lens, absolutely. And that's, I think, our conversation about brand, right? And enticing and encouraging or convincing people to choose Canada over another country. And that the market isn't that big, right? I think that's a big misconception. It's not that big. That it's not an endless pool. So yeah.
And I
That's
think
exactly
one thing
it.
I'd like to add is that by making these 180 changes that you mentioned, we just have a chance of like tarnishing the name, right? Like some of the conversations that you see happening around people having to wait too long for programs like the startup visa, or people that have Canadian work experience, but that they're unable to get selected in the pool and they're considering their alternatives. So that comes down to like these people kind of losing hope and the dream that they built out for themselves because they made a conscious choice of selecting Canada, and then now they're stuck infinitely waiting for their dream to come true.
I have two questions, like that comes to my mind as a follow-up to that.
Sure.
I think what it looks like, the IRCC is kind of postponing or making it harder for TRV applications, but trying to process the permanent residence applications a tiny bit faster. The only exception to this would be a startup visa, which also like takes forever, 40 months. It's like a life cycle of a startup. People build and exit a startup within a life span of 40 months. It's just too much. But I've recently, and I'm not sure if you have any data to speak to this, that even for study visas, study permits, now it takes from certain countries like a year and a half for the permits to be processed. And I'm thinking, if I'm a PhD student, I have a bunch of papers and I'm a master's student, I'm coming to Canada to work on a very specific project. Does this really make sense? What do you see in the communities? Are people thinking, what, forget about it, I'm going to apply for another country? What's happening on the ground?
So for study permits, I know that we have a smaller pool of data. I haven't seen outliers. I have seen a couple of outliers, but mostly it's been under 4 months or so. But where I've seen more consistent like delays has been for work permits. Some of those work permits, I kid you not, if I open up the work permit tracker, are still open, applications open since July, August last year. And if you think about these people, if some of them, for example, are waiting on an open work permit or a PGWP, I would say that's definitely disheartening because they probably want to be on the ground working and doing doing something. And that's a massive delay in their life because they're planning out their next step, but they can't really plan it because a work permit, which doesn't seem like the hardest thing to process on a high level, is taking well over half a year at this point. I don't know if you have something to add to this, Blayne, but
Yeah, well, work permits, the government site, it is inside Canada. There's still a lot of it's taken a long time to process, and overseas it's taken longer. And processing times, all in all, just except in a few areas, which I think we'll cover in a bit, but they've all pretty much went up. And I think a lot has to do. Temporary applications are always the toughest if you're talking about outside of Canada specifically. So yeah, I think Canada is just like, hey, we got to limit people coming into the country, period. We want to limit that. Again, I go back to the election cycles and where we are too, but even just having more, visibly, people, more and more people coming into the country, going to certain places and more visible immigration is kind of impacting that sentiment amongst inside of Canada too, as well. But the PGWP, they also have mechanisms like maintained status, right, which was formerly implied status. So, or when you apply for PGWP, you could work, and that counts towards full-time work. So, I think Canada also has these mechanisms that it feels like, hey, we don't need to rush these things. We could go through that, and also. When you take longer in your work permit and they make a decision down the road, right? So an LMI, for example, it's 6 months usually. You submit it, it could take several months for a decision to come in. God forbid it gets refused. Now that LMIs expire now, right?
yeah,
The same thing for PGWPs. Now, like, your graduation periods are over now, or so there's a
exactly.
lot of loopholes that they could take on and they could do that. And, statistically, a lot of people make lots of mistakes. Um, so that could be another mechanism, which it depends on how you're looking at it. Multiple truths exist at once. I'm a big proponent of that belief. So it depends on how you're
That's
looking
when
at it. Is this a
Blayne,
strategy?
this is exactly when you create, I think like when it is not transparency, that's what happens. I have the experience of building a solution in healthcare, in referral business, right? And everybody says that the wait time, let's say, to see an orthopedic surgeon is 6 months, is 2 months, is 3 months. How can you really pinpoint the wait time? Because it really depends on what the urgency of the case, and who sends the referral and cancellation and who follows up more and blah, blah, blah. So when you create an opaque system, then exactly, it's like the experience can become a little bit individualized, and that necessarily I wouldn't say is a feature, is a bug. It's both a bug and a feature, I would say. But I think, if like sometimes someone comes to you and wants for like ask for some like practical advice in terms of what to do, and like what are some of the common denominators when you look at them, say like you can probably have to wait longer, what like in those outliers, anything that data or policy can share. I think policy is a lot more subtle, like there's probably not anything specifically that mentions, oh, if you're this and this, it's going to take longer for you. But anything that you can share with us in terms of what can lead to a longer wait time for a prospect immigrant to Canada.
So Nino has some, I guess, from a data perspective, that certain countries, especially in temporary applications, permanent residency even too, could take longer. But she could touch on that shortly. My answer from an immigration perspective in terms of doing applications, one is making sure the application is correct and thoroughly completed correctly. Making sure that you don't miss anything, all the details are aligned, that everything is nice and neat. That's one of the aspects. Second is we have to be mindful of AI and technology, and this technology has been around for a long time. Of course, it's definitely gotten better. In a sense, it's gotten better. It's gotten more used, I guess I should say. But you know, technology also plays a role. And the way that I understand the government to implement technology is that they may look at a program and implement it across a program, but usually it's actually within a certain team in that program. So sometimes your application will be submitted, you and five, you know, 1,000 others, but you go to an extra, you know, a team, a specific team, and that team is utilizing a new triage system or new technology to assess and pilot. So that's another factor that can impact times as well. We don't know; it's a black box. They don't let us know of those specific details. Um, you know, due to security risk and ensuring to protect the, you know, the process. But so that's some factors that are be considered. What someone could do, again, going back to that, is making sure your application's good, being aware of processing times and following up with the government. You know, MP's office has always been something that some folks go through, is they contact their local MP in that region and they see if there's something that could be done. You know, that's hit or miss. Some, you know, everyone's a little different in that. Some MP's offices that I've encountered or worked with, some are quite organized. They have things in motion, like they're there, and some, you know, it's hard to even get hold of them. So that's some of the factors. And of course, there is options for federal court as well. You could, you know, hire a lawyer and you could file court proceedings to expedite your application, mandamus. And you could go through those things to expedite, but then there's cost and there's also time associated to that too. So, you know, that's why Immitracker is such a great tool and why people love this tool. It's the best way to get some optics into processing times. That's not a black box, right? And we have a huge community that supports that. So, you know, Nino, you could share a bit more of your findings because I know we talked about this a few weeks ago, but yeah.
Oh, an interesting thing, actually, I'm publishing the article today, is that we did the Q1 analysis for processing times for some of the most popular programs on our platform. So that would be PNPs, Federal Skilled Worker, CEC, Citizenship, and Spousal Sponsorship. And you are right, like for permanent, it does come up in temporary residence as well. So for work permits, study permits, you do also see the impact of nationality. It's just, since those trackers are smaller, I'm hesitant to put those cases out there until we have more data to back it up. But for permanent residents, our trackers are very big. And there are some examples, like I can quote just from this past, like for example, 2024, the longest processing times for federal skilled workers, so cases that took 500 to 600 days, so significantly over a year, were Chinese, Russian, and Indian nationals. For 2024 Canadian experience class, the sixth slowest cases that took over 500 and 600 days were all for Chinese nationals. Every single one of those top 6 slowest cases. And then for Express Entry PNP 2024, the top 2 slowest cases were for Bangladesh and also for China again. The other 5 were Russia, China, and India. So you can kind of see a trend coming up there. Additionally, if I have seen quite a few slow cases come up for Iranian nationals. And what is also interesting, which I think Blayne will touch upon separately, but this is a little bit different, but processing times for things what IRCC says versus what we're seeing. Spousal sponsorship, for example, inland spousal sponsorship, IRCC processing time estimate right now is 24 months. It says 2 years. For outland, it says 11 months. You know what we have been observing for 2024? I think we have been seeing close to 5 months. That's crazy. And that's down from 7.5, 8 months that we're seeing at the start of the year. Right now, what I was doing the article, it was close to 5 months for spousal sponsorship. And citizenship, they're saying 8 months. It's also close to 5 months, even a little bit less than that. So what they're saying for certain things versus what we're seeing is very different. But it is important to be cognizant of those facts. And I've seen the community often talk about like, hey, maybe if I'm a national of this country in this profession, chances of me being delayed are quite high. I have literally seen these conversations happen. And it actually would frequently come up for people that are Chinese nationals or Iranian nationals because they're worried about being delayed. I think you're on mute, Saeed.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
Nope.
No.
I think the microphone is
While
disconnecting.
we're waiting for Zaid, I guess we could just quickly cover that. Zaid, just go ahead and mic test as you're going. But to that
Yeah.
point, though, Nino, there is a lot of fluctuations, and we got to kind of ask yourself why, we've seen some reports from citizenship applications where the government's saying 16 months and we're
Yeah,
seeing 5, 6 months. Even Bright Immigration, we've seen it
exactly.
ourselves too. So it's like, well, what is that? And that's always been a bit concerning for me because, in my experience with Immitracker, you notice that the government updates the timelines within a reasonable amount of time.
Yeah,
Citizenship,
they update them every month.
citizenship they didn't for a long time. We're tracking that, and
Yeah.
we got to kind of wonder why. Well, maybe citizens who are immigrants tend to vote in a certain fashion. Perhaps that's a factor, or maybe they just don't track it as well compared to the other areas. That's another
I think
consideration. But
potentially both. Exactly.
yeah,
Say
so that
that.
was always a bit concerning. But yeah,
Can you hear me now?
yes,
Yes.
we
Okay,
can.
you're back.
Okay, wonderful. So yeah, exactly. I think, people's perception of immigration, especially on the temporary residents, it makes sense that it has to do something with nationality because, as I understand, they get processed at the embassy level. So if there's higher demand, it's like same amount of resources. Obviously, it leads to, different experience. But also it's very interesting that the point you mentioned is like the reality of the cases versus what's advertised. And I think this can be goes beyond just the timelines and deadlines. It also it's a reality versus expectation versus what happens on the ground in like priorities in like what is advertised as the priority or what is actually in fact being prioritized. So that's another factor that I think we will get to. But I wanted to see if you guys can, because CEC is like the most uh, uh, favorite, I would say, like stream amongst most popular, and everybody uses it besides PMPs, but even like they all have to go through CEC. Can you share some new underground, information from policy changes, from shifts? I understand that the score is going down the obviously because of the LMIA, what happened with LMIA and all that. But if you can share some historic data on this specific program and also some like extrapolation of what we can expect happening in the next coming months. Obviously, like election being the wild card that can change things fundamentally. But yeah, that would be really really I think insightful and interesting.
Yeah. Um, the express entry program, I love the express entry program as a Canadian, not so much as an immigration professional, just because it's a pain in the butt to deal with. But as a Canadian, I love the program. I think it's amazing, and I wish we utilize it more effectively. I don't feel like we are, but it is a phenomenal program. And that was launched in 2014. It was developed really well by the previous government. So I think it's a great program. Now, in terms of what we're seeing, French mobility is massive. Sorry, not French mobility, the French category. It's definitely a huge chunk of the numbers right now. I think it's over 20 something thousand since October, whereas CEC's around 11,000 onwards since October. But that number is coming up. So the points are expected to come down because you're removing the LMIAs. But there's still a lot of people in the pool who sits above 500. But that's, I do expect it to come down. And we do have a huge population that is inside Canada that has studied, that is neither working or about, starting to work, or they've been working for years, and they need to be attended to a degree. So I think we're going to definitely see that come down. The French programs, it's a bit interesting to me because, the French programs are for folks to settle outside of Quebec. And, anyone who's traveled Canada, there's definitely French regions, New Brunswick and certain pockets in Northern Ontario, etc. But, it's definitely Anglophone. It's English speaking in most of Canada. So and you speak to anyone who's bilingual, who speaks, it's one thing that if you don't practice the language in years and years and years, where does the language sit after? So it's one of the things that does concern me is why such a big focus on the French side. I do not complete, of course, we have two languages and I respect that. I understand that perspective. But why is that being prioritized over healthcare, for example? By the looks of care, maybe they just haven't gotten to it. So I'll give you, maybe there's that consideration. Um, but yeah, other categories are far less. Canadian experience class French is definitely big, but other categories are really trailing behind. Trades are,
Mm.
not much.
The
I
tech
think,
prop, they
yeah,
barely any of
health
those.
in the last since October was 3,000. So we're talking about like 10% for healthcare compared to the French, just over 10%. And the other category, STEM, there hasn't been a draw. There's been changes to the occupations, which I don't disagree with them. I think they're good changes. They removed a lot of the software developers and engineers, which unfortunately there's a lot of people here, don't get me wrong. But again, from a Canadian lens, I think that they're focusing on maybe some other areas where we need where we have labor shortages. But yeah, so hopefully that answers your question a bit. But I am hopeful that points are going to come down. CEC is definitely going to hopefully do a bit better. I think after an election is going to be a big thing. For those who maybe think that the French focus is for political purposes or focus to the political side, once the political stuff is kind of over and done with conversationally, maybe they will start focusing on other areas. So hopefully that, that would be another factor.
And one tidbit I'd really like to add to that, and Blayne, you're definitely familiar with this because you used to do recruiting. The mechanism for these people integrating into the community, even after they get selected and their PR gets approved, is very difficult, right? Because before I started working on Immitracker, I used to work on an employment service marketplace for immigrants. And the process for immigrants to get integrated into Canadian society, get a good job that's matching their skills relatively, like we understand you have to start a little bit lower, we all did that. But like that process is very difficult. And you see those conversations even come up in our settlement chat, people saying, oh, I'm moving to this region. Where can I find a job? How can I even look for a job? Do you guys have any referrals? And I think that's even more exacerbated by what Blayne is saying, is that when you're focusing on like French speaking, these people also need to settle and get jobs and integrate into the society here, right, outside of Quebec. So how is that portion being handled? Not entirely clear, and that's not even something we as a startup that's very active in this space have any visibility into.
I think one concept, one notion that really resonates with me is the definition of job and career. Most of the governments try to make or create jobs, whereas the people really need careers. And I think also we can borrow that notion and bring it to immigration. Like when you immigrate with purpose, the goal of immigration is to advance your life, your career, reach new horizons and all that. And when we create a transparent system, and that's why I'm super excited about Immitracker, because you bring transparency to a very, opaque process. So like you send the application, it almost goes to a void. Like the CEI, every few months later, you hear a notification or something. It's like, yes, exactly. Like you really are not sure what is the expectation and all that. But I think one of the benefits of adding transparency is helping people to prepare and make right choices for themselves. Is it a good idea rather than just getting in? Is it a good idea for me to first of all get in with what program, and where is the best place for me to settle? Is it good for me to come to Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, or maybe, there are opportunities for me in New Brunswick? But unfortunately, what ends up happening on the ground is even those provincial programs are also being, people are kind of like merged into like candidates for the province, but they may not have, a future there. So they land there and they end up going to, the hotspots. So I think if we bring more, that's why I advocate, obviously, like I'm not an we are business people at the end of the day, right? We're not activists, but we think, that if we make the process transparent, then people can make right choices and prepare themselves to build a life in Canada rather than just relocating and then see, okay, now what do I do now, basically.
Yeah. But at the same time, there's a lot of advantages by not having it transparent. right? So for for those who, who are dealing with the national interests of the country. So, it's the best way to, in my opinion, the best way to control immigration isn't necessarily through policy, it's timelines. That's the best way to control immigration, because to the public, you still look very like pro-immigration, but processing times, on the other hand, very different story. And the general public does operate, especially in this day and age with social media and the 7 second, not even 7 second attention. I would even call it a 2 second attention span now,
Exactly.
less actually. I remember I was in the ad space 15 years ago, before I was in immigration, and 8 seconds was the number. Now I really think it's maybe one or two. But long story short, I'm thinking that the duration's the best. That's why Immitracker is the tool that, I think is going to always be applicable. Doesn't matter what happens in the world, just because immigration is best controlled through timelines, right? Whereas, headlines, they don't talk about timelines in the headlines. They talk about programs. They talk about closing this down or changing that. That makes headlines. So you could still have these great programs. You could double the number, but hey, if it's taking 3, 4, 5, 10 years, like the US has done that. US does a lot of
Oh yeah.
control in the processing times. They still have programs available, but and listen, if they want to, they just speed up the timeline, process them, bang. Now you got numbers coming in. So there's a lot of control in the timeline. So for the transparency, I completely agree that it would be amazing, but it's up to us. It's up to the citizens. It's up to those people who wish to come to Canada and make it a home. It's up to us to make it transparent.
Mhm.
It's up to us as entrepreneurs. Like, we have a company called Improved, which is dedicated to transparency to make sure people don't get scammed and are aware of the options. And Immitracker provides transparency in the timelines. So, it's up to us to really make those changes and to push that and make it happen as a community.
And one thing I'd like to add to that, and Blayne, I think you and I talked about this last year about like using processing timelines to control numbers. We noticed in the community, and then I also double checked that was the case in the trackers, a lot of people for whose applications for permanent residence were pretty much already approved and a decision was made, their e-co-PRs or co-PRs were began being held up starting somewhere around like mid to end of October until the end of the year. So they would have everything ready, and then the moment Q4 hits, their co-PRs are not really being issued. And there was a lot of conversation I remember happening in the community, like, guys, where's our co-PR? Why is it not being issued? And one of the theories Blayne and I were talking about then, that it was potentially because as soon as those co-PRs get issued in 2025, those are already 2025 immigrants, right? They're already not going into the 2024 quota, because it was immediately as soon as Q4 hit that we noticed a decline in the co-PR issuance for approved applications.
It's also very interesting, insight that you can share. And just to both of you, if like we just take a look at 2024, 2023, and 2024, we had some big headlines, big news announcements. And we don't have to get into specifics if you don't want to, but how do you see these announcements, like the context and the subject and the what the announcement entails? How do you see this actually impacting the real like experience of the people? For example, IRCC says we're going to prioritize this specific stream,
Yeah.
or we are excited about, and then like what, so you expect that things are going to get better, faster, improved. How do you see like that translating to people's real life
Mhm.
experience in terms of timelines?
I actually have a fantastic example for that one because of the article I published today. So for the cases that we took to analyze for the Q1 report, I saw for 3 months only like less than 20 federal skilled worker cases being logged on the platform, which is very low. This is the lowest amount of cases I've seen logged for federal skilled worker programs since we started running the report in like mid 2023. However, for CC, we saw close to 150 cases that got completed, which is significantly more than anything that it's like triple the numbers that what we had beginning of last year. So when the government said last year that they are going to prioritize Canadian experience class, well, guess what? I'm seeing the application approvals increase on the platform and the applications being logged on the platform more actively. And even if you look at the groups, like our CEC group is very active in WhatsApp. The federal skilled worker group has barely been moving, and the few cases that I have seen actually, Blayne, have been from the French-speaking draws, more people that came in through that. And then PNP numbers I saw where our case count was exactly half of the case count that we saw of CEC, just a little bit lower. So pretty much what the government said, like the space that they're allocating, I'm seeing a reduced version of that on Immitracker in the community and the trackers, because we kind of get an even spread of people from all different programs and nationalities. So it's very interesting to see how what they said last year is coming to fruition in terms of numbers now. But the flip side of that is that the government hasn't been saying pretty much anything about family sponsorship or spousal sponsorship or citizenship, but then we're seeing these insane changes be happening in these programs and these accelerated timelines, which what is the motivation behind them or why that's happening? We have no idea, but we just know that it's a thing and the government's kind of like not commenting on it.
Do you have anything to add, Blayne?
Yeah, and just to the point, just a reminder that all of these are just observations of what we're seeing, what we're noticing, right? Like we don't have the tracking of every single file. We don't have the tracking of, and we also, those who use Immitracker tend to be folks who are, who may have a certain types of backgrounds, who appreciate data, for example. So, it's important to know that these are just our observations and thoughts. But going to that point and being in immigration as long as I have, the government it goes either way. Sometimes they say something to actually mean it. Sometimes they say something they just don't mean it at all, or they don't, or things change and they just don't say it. So remember, we're fundamentally immigration is very, very politicized. It's very focused on that. It is incredibly, I can't emphasize enough, politicized, we're dealing with people who aren't Canadians, and we're talking about people who are about to be Canadians. There's a lot of control, a lot of levers the government has, and they could say things and they could not do it, or they could say things and mean it, right? And we've seen that, just even they pull back the field of study requirement for postgraduate work permits. So, they were really coming down hard on that, and then they pulled it back. But did it make the headlines? It didn't, right? What made the headlines was them cracking down on it, but it didn't put, so, and that's okay. And I understand that's how the game is played, and that's understandable. But it's important to know that when I'm advising clients, policies that haven't taken impact yet, haven't actually happened. So LMI draws, 3 months ago, when they were talking about the LMI, sorry, points, 50 points, I was telling clients, listen, I do not know if it's actually going to happen, right? So you have to make a decision. Do you want to play to that, or do you want to completely not do that? How do you want to adjust your strategy? And I don't feel comfortable saying this will happen 100% until it does, just because I've seen it happen and change. So to the point, Nino, recognizing that there's been some programs are moving faster, some are, others aren't. I can't help but notice sponsorships, which, a lot of times citizens are impacted. Canadian citizens, aka voters, are sponsoring someone. That those applications are moving quite fast, especially inside of Canada.
Yeah.
And again, citizenships move fast, right? But other applications all have been, I think all of them are taking longer than where it was 6 months ago. Even express entries are still taking longer. Even CEC still, so everything is getting longer. Now, why? Is it because of staff? Well, not really. The staff numbers are still the same from what I understand. Technology use has definitely went up. So, I don't think it's a choice, it seems like. I think I don't know. I don't understand if it's a bottleneck or not. I don't think it's a bottleneck.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, that's the exact reason why like at Nextars we try to host these discussions, because obviously it's a choice and it's policy. And what we are trying to do is to basically share maybe a new perspective, different ideas with the policymakers, and our hope is for them to listen or like bits and pieces of this and think, oh, there's like maybe a different side to the story as well, or learn from how things are happening on the ground. Because I think what you guys have, the type of data, the type of analytics that you guys can share in terms of most importantly the sentiment of people, can be I think a factor in terms of decision making. How people feel about Canada, about the their prospects in Canada is, I think if I was the government, I would absolutely want to know that, right? And just Blayne, to your point about like immigration being political, absolutely. Now I think I read an article in Guardian a while ago that after, I think for the first time ever, the majority of Canadians like are against immigration now. So we definitely see that impacting the timelines, the quotas, everything. And I read an article. It's like written by econ prof at U of T and an econ prof in, I think it was Harvard, if I'm not mistaken. And it was a very interesting research, super interesting. It basically examined people's, like how a policy change influences people on immigration. So if a pro-immigration message comes out of a party that is typically against immigration, this has 5 times or 6 times influence on people than a pro-immigration message coming from a party that people expect to be pro-immigration. So yes, so it really like changes minds and it ignites emotions in people when they hear a message that they don't expect to hear, from a party or from a group. I will find that paper and I will send it to you.
Love to see that.
Very interesting thing.
At the end of the day, it boils down to psychology, right? And that's really what it all is. I read a report saying that an unhappy client that is now happy is more satisfied than a client who's never been unhappy, right?
Yes.
So, definitely, I'm definitely not saying to have your clients be unhappy so you can make it right, but it boils down to psychology, and that's all it comes down to. And because of the amount of information we have and the data we have that it's at our fingertips, the governments know playbooks and everyone knows playbooks and we have a lot of data points that we could work to. So when immigration is pulled into question, it's always it's a very easy lever for governments to pull. However, Canada is also aware that the immigrant population, they have to be considered, and they have to have, they have to get a voter base in there too. So and even I was liberal government was a big focus for our family as we were younger, just because Pierre Trudeau's father really opened up immigration, and there was that consideration over that time. So we understood that as well, but I think we just have to be mindful. I hate to keep coming back to politics, but I really don't have any other explanation for anything that's really happening right now but that. In all honesty, I think immigration is critical. It's important. It's very clear that it helps economies. That's without a question. So it is very good for us as a nation. But I do feel that, we're just we haven't been doing a good job of that completely. And I understand Canadians their sentiment is changed or has changed. I agree or disagree, but I could understand where it's coming, like why it's here. And it has a lot to do with planning and just organizing and just, doing a good job of things, right? And I think immigration, we doubled numbers, but we didn't plan it thoroughly. The housing didn't make sense. I live in Toronto. I know that they will start charging development fees, even to build an extra unit onto an existing property, 70, 80, $100,000. But yet you're bringing in so many people. So it was a bit obvious, that this would have happened. So that's why when I advised clients back then, I said, you got to do it now. I'm telling you, immigration won't stay the same. It's a cycle, it's a cycle just like everything else.
And I can actually bring up a personal story from this as well. It's like this immigration is a cycle everywhere, right? Like just when I did my undergrad, I did it in the US, and just like everybody that went through as an international student with me, we were all expected to get a job. We had OPTs instead of PGWPs, and we wanted to get a job, get sponsored, and stay in the US, continue working later on, potentially transition to a green card. And what happened is that the people that got in, that graduated 2-3 years before me, they were pretty much, most of them were very successful at securing their work visa and transitioning onto a green card after. People that graduated like the year before me, my year, and a couple of years after, we got completely screwed. And that's because we just ended up in the wrong cycle of immigration. And if you think about it, and going back to like selling to the candidates and like being a salesperson, like this country is your dream, like it was the dream for a few years before. It was the dream even when we were looking into it. But then the cycle that we got stuck in was just not the right cycle. And this is something that I think a lot of immigrants need to be cognizant of. And I think they're not, based on the conversations that I've been seeing, even in our community, because once a certain expectation has been set based on the processing times or the program priorities over the past few years, people have this mindset that, oh, it's going to stay that way because I was made this promise. But just like Blayne said, immigration is very politicized. They can change policy, and they are allowed to change policy. They're the ones that set it out, right? So what you need to be cognizant of as an immigrant, that this is very much a journey that could have a lot of roadblocks, and you should be all right knowing that in advance, and you should be able to work with it, because at the end of the day, like, nothing is guaranteed. And I think that's what a lot of people in the group chats and the communities that I've been moderating are talking about. They're thinking about ways to make this journey easier for them. Like, they're talking about contacting their MPs if their applications are delayed, or doing the mandamus, or taking things into their own hands, because they understand that at the end of the day, it's all up to them to make this process work, right?
And for those that don't know, MP is a member of parliament for federal member of parliament, not the provincial. So I have so many questions, and I don't think we have plenty of time, but I just want to touch on a few things that are very important. I'm not sure if you guys at Immitracker are also asking people if they do have a representative or not. First and foremost, is it like, does it help your case if you have a representative? Second question is, what you should look for when you are like looking for a representative? What are some, because there are a lot of, unfortunately, like bad apples, like scammers out there. How can one figure out if like the representative that they're for them is actually vouching for their interest and it's going to help them around the journey?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Blayne.
that's a really important question to have. And so to basically start off, first and foremost, hiring a lawyer or immigration consultant doesn't necessarily speed up your application. What it does is having an experienced set of eyes and mind and hands working on your file to ensure you're not making mistakes and optimizing your application as much as possible. I highly recommend that people do, especially now, just spend the money and do it, to be frank. Don't underestimate it. It's just too important right now. And save money on who you hire to do your accountant. Worst case, you pay some fees. Money can't fix your immigration problems, right? You're working to start a visa, you deal with business people all the time. You deal with people who are starting companies who raise money, and they still have a hard time. So money doesn't solve immigration problems. Speeding up time, I wouldn't say so. Reputation matters a lot, a lot. Just like in the accounting world, a lot of auditing happens because an accountant was found to be doing some things that weren't wasn't done, and they just look at the client list and they know who's represented who's. That's really important. I can't stress that enough. I've seen over and over, sometimes CBSA would ask, who's your immigration representative? They want to know who that person is. And it's important that you're working with credible people who care about Canada first and foremost. People who care about Canada won't take on those files where we're not bringing in good quality people or taking on documents that weren't correctly prepared. So when you're looking at a representative, you want to make sure that that's the case. Representation wise, if they're licensed, please note, any lawyer, immigration consultant, there is a database you could quickly Google and you could find out if they're an immigration consultant. It's CICC. Just Google immigration consultant regulations or number. Okay, and there's a database. You search the name, the number will come up. The law societies. Every province has a law society. Look it up. You should find their name. Paralegals cannot practice immigration. I've heard stories, and I've had a personal situation where a paralegal was pretending to be a lawyer, and she was actually well known in the industry. So, just be mindful of that. But just please look to the numbers, look up that person, get referrals if you can, speak to them. If they have online reviews, yeah, online reviews can be faked. I'm not, but our regulators actually say if it's a fake review, we could get in trouble. So, our reviews are 100% legitimate. So, so there is all of that. that you want to pay attention to. But definitely hire an experts. My advice, quite frankly, is try to work with people inside of Canada. I find that representatives inside of Canada, for one, they're already vetted, and now you're dealing with someone inside of Canada. There's legal recourses inside of Canada. Hopefully, you could lean to. And I find that people who have experience working with inside Canada applications have a far more wealth of experience because they deal with everything. Folks who deal with outside of Canada, the minute they file, the minute they do it, it's gone. Like they don't really deal too much coming back up. So, so we see the consequence of screwing up a PR application when we're filing a citizenship application. We see those consequences. We see the consequence of someone, switching to PNP, switching to country, going to Toronto when they were supposed to be in Saskatchewan. We see that consequence come up in those cases. So just something to be mindful of as well. But yeah, just look for reputation, look for experienced people who've been around, and just be mindful if someone's saying, if you're outside of Canada and someone's saying, oh, you could get PR, this, we could do that. Just know you want to pay attention to it. If you're above the age of 40 years old, probably not going to happen unless you're in a business program, in all honesty. Things like that.
One thing I would like to add to that as well is that at Immitracker, we are also very cognizant of this. So I don't have the exact numbers on how long or how many of our users are represented, but I think we did a survey back in 2023 and it was no more than 30 to 35% that had a representative. But regardless, we're very cognizant of that. We don't allow people to share their own personal immigration service links within the community. We only refer to people that we know and trust. So if somebody's coming to us, we will refer them, for example, to Bright Immigration because we know that we can trust Bright Immigration. Or if there's a lawyer that they need help from, we do have a lawyer that we refer to because we also know that's a legitimate lawyer that's registered and there's no risk of fraud, at least that we know of that is there. But we understand that a lot of people will put trust in the wrong ones, and it's very important to make sure those checks are in place, especially like Blayne mentioned now, because I have seen so many conversations about rejections come up in the community, especially within the past few months. So rejections are definitely on the rise, and even a small mistake when somebody before would write that, oh, I got a request for additional documents, now a rejection might come in, right? So keep that in mind and make sure that whoever you work with, you can actually trust. Don't click any random links. Don't trust people that you don't trust. And when you go through a program, make sure you understand your program. Like, because I've seen questions like, oh, this happened in the community. Somebody would say, oh, I'm going through a PNP for Ontario, but can I just settle in BC? And whoever they were working with clearly did not stress that enough for them, or they don't have this understanding. So make sure you really understand what you're signing up for and who you're working with, and you do your due diligence, because this is arguably, if not the most important, one of the top 3 most important processes you're going to go through in your life, right, as an immigrant.
And one thing that I can add in terms of vetting representatives is that, is the program that they're suggesting you really a fit for you? Like, does it really make sense to yourself? Set aside IRCC, set aside officers and all that. Does it really make sense to you, first and foremost? And do you kind of feel like this, like, as you would know, like if they say, oh, you're gonna be an employee of this company, but not really, you're gonna pay, but you're not gonna show up, already like this. There's something going on, right? So you're not really, you're smart, you're better than this. So you have to really work with people that and watch for the recommendations that they give to you. Like, always work with credible professionals. As Blayne mentioned, those societies like law societies or CIC, there's people that have license, they're always more trusted. They have to adhere to a bar and they have proper training, and and also like ask around, like people have similar experiences, and often they're outspoken. So Nino, I have a question for you specifically, because you came to this like to Immitracker from like on a client perspective. Like, you obviously been, but you're more on the client side. If you had like a magic wand, like you could change one thing about the immigration without even like worrying about how policy shapes, changes, like limitations, what is it that you would do to make life better for Immitracker clients?
Oh, That's a that's a tough question because honestly, there's a lot of things that could be fixed. But realistically, if I had a magic wand, what I would fix is not even as much as the immigrant. I would want to fix the immigration process itself, don't get me wrong, but I think the portion that I would want fixed is the settlement, the transitioning of these people that have received their paperwork into successfully integrated members of society with careers and jobs that make sense. And touching upon that, also ensuring that immigration policy correctly reflects to select the people that are best suited to be integrated into society, to be getting their paperwork rather than looking at things more arbitrarily. Because I personally know cases where people that I know that could get good jobs are not getting selected, for example, to apply for express entry. And then I know people that are getting selected based on other arbitrary criteria that they struggle later on to find jobs. And I feel like there's this massive mismatch that's happening that I don't know why there's not a lot of communication between the settlement portion and the immigration portion, but that's the portion that I would want to fix with a magic wand personally.
Awesome. How about you, Blayne? Now you understand all the limitations and how things happen on the ground. Like you probably would be a lot more targeted and a bit less ambitious because you know how things happen in the policy. But what would be one thing that you change about how things happen right now in our immigration?
Yes, I'll just relate it to like my mission, my purpose right now in life is to create more transparency. And the reason I was born in Canada, but my family were, they're from Trinidad and Fiji, and their family, their ancestors came from India. And I believe we're the first groups of people to be deceived in immigration in the sense that, in the mid 1800s, the British convinced my ancestors in India to relocate to places for better job opportunities and for, be able to go back home after. And they were essentially enslaved. This was right at the end of slavery and the abolishment of slavery. This was the loophole they identified. Um, for me, it's a personal matter of kind of not, it's enough now. It's enough of doing this. And though I do not think, we're not putting, they're not putting people on boats and with a 15%, 10 to 15% death rate, but we are having people come to Canada with expectations and an understanding, and we are switching it very abruptly on them. I understand that there's things that have to occur, and I understand things happen, and that's okay. I was in recruitment. I worked in the oil industry before. I brought folks in, and then all of a sudden the oil bust happened, and unfortunately things change. That happens. But there's a lot of transparency issues that we're seeing, and it is a big problem. And we have to start really respecting immigration. It's a human thing. Where the worst thing I say the worst thing we could do to the world is taking people from developed nations who are, developing nations, people who are, in countries that are trying to get on their feet, taking the best and the brightest and bringing them here just to impoverish them further. That is the worst thing as humanity that I've identified we could do. And I don't want to be harsh with this, but my experience in it, with my ancestral background, I just can't help but still feel we're doing the same thing, just in different shades. So I would love for people to just be more informed and be educated so they can make the right decision. They could come to Canada, they could weigh the balances of the pros and cons adequately, and then let the cards fall as they fall. And then to Nino's point, we could actually start finding people who, maybe they don't have a master's degree, but they have an amazing work ethic or whatever it is, right? Like there's a lot of amazing people out there who wouldn't even qualify to come to Canada, who are doing amazing things in Canada right now. And that's for the rest of the world. So I think it's time we start looking at the whole picture. And like I said, a lot of immigration is very concentrated. It's essentially marketing is what I think it is. It's like, hey, do you have a visa office? Do you have signs in your town, in your village? Do you have it? Great. You're going to have more influx. But there's a lot of places that don't have that, and we're not getting those people because you know, they're just not being marketed to. So, let's create a more honest immigration system. Let's do a better job of marketing across the wide spread of people in the world. And let's start attracting people, not just on the, if they went to university or not necessarily, but, who are they and what are they up to?
Yeah,
Oh,
agreed.
well, thank you so much, both Nino and Blayne, for sharing these invaluable insights and experiences. I think this was really, really enticing for me, and I think people that attended and will listen to this conversation would really enjoy this session and learn a lot. I learned a lot myself. We all hope gathered around here. We hope for, we advocate for a better, obviously better system. We think that Canada should be still the beacon around the world for the bright, the ambitious, the talented. But as like to your point also, Blayne, it really resonated with me. We should and Nino touched on from a different perspective. We should really like people like immigrate to make a better life. So like immigrating is not, to me, like is not the goal. It's basically a means to achieve a goal, right? So the goal is to live a happy life, to live a content life, to enjoy and to prosper, and also to improve and advance as a human being. And from that lens, we see worlds through a global lens. Like, people should be able to go wherever they wish to in hopes and aspirations to achieve that goal. So I wish we had more time for Q&A, but if anyone has a very short question, they can raise their hand and I can unmute them to speak. But if not, that would be the wrap, and it will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. Next Stars, please do give us a follow or like. It doesn't cost you anything, but it definitely makes us feel better. And and if there's any specific topic that you would like us to discuss or to bring up, please share with us. Leave a comment or reach out us at LinkedIn or on our website. I will leave the links to Immitracker and the LinkedIn profiles of Nino and Blayne in the comment section as well. So yes, I guess that's it. Thank you so much again. And yeah, onwards to the next one.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.